Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're diving deep into the book of Exodus.
Exodus.
Yeah, we're looking at the Israelites' escape from Egypt and all that that entails.
Right.
And we've got excerpts covering lots of stuff. I mean, we've got dramatic events like the plagues and then really intricate details about the tabernacle and some interesting interpretations from the footnotes, as always.
Yeah, what's interesting is that people often think of Exodus as just a historical account, but it's
Right.
so much more than that.
Yeah.
It's kind of this tapestry woven with theological insights and, cultural nuances
I love that.
and these little linguistic puzzles that scholars have been debating for
A
centuries.
tapestry with little puzzles in it.
Yeah.
So today we're going to try to unravel some of those threads, especially the ones tucked away in the footnotes.
Yeah.
We might even uncover a few aha moments
Oh, I love this.
as we connect seemingly unrelated details. What do you say? Are you ready to explore?
Absolutely. I think you'll be surprised by what we discover along the way.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning with the Israelites' enslavement in Egypt.
Okay.
The excerpts open with this seemingly simple phrase. Joseph was already in Egypt.
Right.
But the footnote points out how the Hebrew wording actually emphasizes how Joseph was already settled there. Unlike his brothers, it almost feels like this subtle reminder of the amount of time
Yeah.
that had passed since Joseph first arrived in Egypt.
It's a great example of how even a single phrase can carry so much weight.
Yeah,
And it kind of sets the stage for the rise of this new pharaoh who didn't know Joseph.
right. A new pharaoh that didn't know Joseph.
Meaning that generations had come and gone, and
Right.
that memory of Joseph's contributions to Egypt had faded.
So this new pharaoh sees the growing Israelite population as a threat.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
bam,
Enslavement.
And that brings us to the birth of Moses, which is described in language that mirrors the creation account in Genesis.
Oh, wow.
I mean, the footnote pointing that out just blew my mind.
Yeah.
What do you make of that connection?
It's not just a coincidence. The text is intentionally drawing this parallel between the creation of the world
Right.
and the birth of Moses. This child destined to lead his people to freedom.
Right.
It's almost like hinting at this new creation, a new beginning for the Israelites.
I'm starting to see how these seemingly small details add these deeper layers of meaning to the story.
Yeah.
And then there's this other intriguing footnote about Moses fleeing to Midian after killing an Egyptian.
Right.
The footnote connects this to the reign of a specific pharaoh, placing the Exodus around 1450 BC. It's like this historical puzzle piece snapping into place.
It is.
Does that help us understand the timeline of events better?
It does offer a possible time frame for the Exodus.
Okay.
Rounding the story in this historical context, the exact date is still debated
But-
among scholars, but this clue gives us a good starting point for understanding the broader narrative.
Then we have the very iconic scene of God calling to Moses through a burning bush.
Yes.
Now, the footnote about the word visit caught my eye.
Okay.
It explains that, this isn't just a casual drop-in.
Right.
It's more like God actively stepping into human history to orchestrate this deliverance.
Exactly. The word choice really emphasizes God's intentionality and power. He isn't passively observing the Israelites' suffering. He's taking action to liberate them.
Wow.
And to convince Moses, he gives him these 3 signs.
Right, turning his staff into a snake, his hand becoming leprous, and turning the Nile water into blood.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The footnote explains that the magicians were likely able to replicate that first plague because it didn't actually turn all the water into blood.
Oh.
What's going on there was that God's way of demonstrating his power was on another level.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it raises this fascinating debate about the nature of the plagues. Were they purely supernatural events defying all natural laws?
Right.
Or did God work through natural phenomena? The text seems to suggest a combination of both, adding this layer of complexity to our understanding.
That definitely adds a new dimension to the story, especially for those of us who always assumed it was all purely supernatural.
Right.
Speaking of the plagues, there are a few other footnotes that reveal these surprising details.
Oh, yeah.
For example, the plague of flies might have simply intensified an existing problem, building on what's described in Psalm 78.45.
It's an interesting perspective, right?
Yeah.
It suggests that God doesn't always create something entirely new.
Right.
Instead, he can work through existing conditions to achieve his purposes.
Wow.
It makes you think about how even seemingly natural events could have a deeper meaning.
Okay, mind blown again.
Yeah.
Then there's this footnote correcting this outdated view that camels weren't domesticated during that time.
Right.
This is specifically about the plague that killed livestock.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that our understanding of history is constantly evolving.
Right.
As we make new discoveries, we should always be open to re-examining our assumptions and interpretations in light of new evidence.
Now, before the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn,
Yeah.
there's an interesting footnote about the ambiguity of Pharaoh's warning to the Israelites.
Uh-huh.
Apparently, it could be an allusion to his sun god Re.
That small detail adds another layer to the story. By invoking his god, Pharaoh is essentially challenging Yahweh,
Right.
setting up this cosmic battle between the God of Israel and the gods of Egypt. But of course, as the story tells us, Yahweh's power prevails.
Now, the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn,
Yeah.
is a difficult one to grapple with, but there's a footnote that suggests it could be seen as a fulfillment
Okay.
of that earlier principle of an eye for an eye. It's a stark reminder of how serious the situation was
Right.
and the consequences of Pharaoh's continued defiance. What do you think about that interpretation?
It certainly raises questions about the nature of justice and retribution in the Old Testament, a topic that has generated lots of discussion and debate throughout history.
For sure. But before we get too bogged down in that, let's talk about the Israelites' dramatic escape from Egypt
Okay.
and the Passover meal, eating unleavened bread marking doors with lamb's blood.
Right.
It's all so symbolic.
It is.
And I was surprised to learn that the unleavened bread, while representing haste in the Exodus story, later came to symbolize purity. What do you think about the evolution of that symbolism?
Well, it's a great example of how these ancient texts hold layers of meaning
Right.
that unfold over time. The Passover meal itself becomes this powerful symbol of both liberation and spiritual cleansing. And the specific instructions regarding the lamb are pretty intriguing, too.
Yeah, the lamb has to be a yearling, and the footnote helpfully explains what that means.
Right.
In the original Hebrew, it also mentions the lamb could be either a sheep or a goat, which I didn't realize before. And there's that part about the punishment for eating leavened bread during Passover.
Right.
The footnote goes into great detail about the implications of being cut off from Israel.
It really underscores the importance of obedience and ritual purity within the Israelite community.
Right.
It's not just about blindly following rules. It's about maintaining that sacred covenant with God.
Speaking of dramatic events, we can't forget the parting of the Red Sea.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, talk about a showstopper.
Talk about a showstopper.
The miraculous nature of this event is undeniable.
It is.
But then there's this footnote suggesting a possible natural explanation involving strong winds and tides. What are we to make of that?
It's one of those moments where we see this tension between the miraculous and the potentially explainable.
Yeah.
It invites us to consider different perspectives and how we interpret these ancient accounts.
Right.
Do we take them literally, or do we look for scientific explanations?
Yeah.
It's a question we still grapple with today.
It's fascinating how this ancient text can spark these contemporary debates.
Yeah.
Now, after crossing the Red Sea, Moses and the Israelites break out in song, the Song of Triumph in Exodus 15.
Yeah.
There's a footnote comparing it to other praise psalms
Right.
and highlighting its structure, which I thought was pretty cool.
It's a beautiful example of how ancient people express their gratitude and awe when faced with the divine.
Right.
The song itself becomes this testament to God's power and faithfulness.
It really does.
And then, just when you think the Israelites might have learned their lesson, they start complaining about water at Marah.
Of course they do. Why am I not surprised?
Yeah.
The footnote tries to explain this by referring to a specific well known for its bitter, salty water. The question is, does that explanation fully align with the biblical account?
Yeah.
Is there something more to the story than just bad-tasting water?
It's a valid question sometimes, even when we have a scientific or historical explanation.
Right.
There's still this element of mystery and faith that we need to wrestle with.
It seems like that tension between faith and reason is a recurring theme throughout Exodus.
Yes.
And honestly, throughout life in general.
Absolutely. It's a tension we still experience today as we try to make sense of the world around us and our place within it.
Next up, we have the miraculous provision of manna.
Manna.
The bread from heaven.
Yeah.
But here's a curveball. The footnote suggests that this event might be separate from a similar event described in the book of Numbers. Is it possible there were two different instances of manna?
It highlights the complexities that we sometimes encounter in biblical scholarship.
Right.
Trying to reconcile different accounts can be challenging.
Yes.
And it requires this careful analysis and consideration of multiple perspectives.
Okay, so maybe we don't have all the answers, but one thing's clear.
Yeah.
The manna represents God's incredible provision and care for his people.
It does.
Speaking of provisions, there's also the story of Moses bringing water from the rock at Rephidim.
Right.
The footnote explains how the place got its name, Massa and Meribah, which means testing and striving.
It's a poignant reminder that even when surrounded by miracles, human doubt and disobedience can still surface.
It's so human, isn't it? That internal struggle between trusting God's promises and giving in to fear and uncertainty.
It is.
I guess these stories remind us that even in our own lives, doubt and faith can coexist.
They do.
Now let's move on to a really pivotal moment in the story, the Ten Commandments and the covenant at Mount Sinai.
Okay.
The footnote emphasizes their role in revealing God's standard of righteousness.
Yeah.
And how our obedience should flow from a heart of gratitude for God's redemption.
It's a beautiful way of articulating the relationship between grace and law.
Right.
The Ten Commandments aren't just arbitrary rules. They're a reflection of God's character and a guide for how we can live in right relationship with him and with each other.
It's really about how to live a life that's both pleasing to God and beneficial to ourselves and to others.
Absolutely.
And out of all the commandments, the one about remembering the Sabbath seems to have sparked the most discussion and interpretation in the footnotes. It's clearly not just about taking a day off,
Right.
but about intentionally setting apart the holy crust from the profane and reflecting on creation.
I find it fascinating how the Sabbath commandment connects us back to the very beginning, to that creation account in Genesis.
Right.
It's a reminder that we're part of something much larger than ourselves,
Yeah.
this cosmic order established by a loving creator.
Wow. I never thought about it like that before.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the infamous golden calf incident.
The golden calf.
Moses is up on the mountain receiving the Ten Commandments, and down below, the Israelites are getting impatient and, well, a little idolatrous.
Yeah, a little idolatrous.
That footnote explaining that ambiguous phrase, the sound of the answering, is intriguing.
Right.
It doesn't tell us whether it's the sound of victory or defeat, right?
Exactly. The ambiguity highlights the uncertainty and chaos of that moment.
Right.
The text leaves us wondering, which just adds to the drama.
And then we have Moses' reaction, smashing those tablets.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, talk about a dramatic gesture. It's this visceral image of a shattered covenant, a broken relationship between God and his people.
It's a moment of profound disappointment and anger.
Right.
But even amidst the brokenness, there's this glimmer of hope. The covenant is ultimately renewed, emphasizing God's unwavering commitment to his people.
It's reassuring to be reminded that God's love and forgiveness are stronger than our mistakes.
They are.
And that leads us into a whole new section, the instructions for building the tabernacle.
Okay.
We've got pages and pages of detailed blueprints, material lists.
Wow.
It's incredibly specific and complex.
It shows how important sacred space was.
Right.
And the meticulous care that went into creating this dwelling place for God among his people.
It's not just about bricks and mortar, though, is it?
No, it's not.
That footnote about the pattern of the tabernacle potentially being a vision of the heavenly sanctuary just blows my mind.
It suggests that this earthly tabernacle was actually a reflection of a heavenly reality.
Wow.
This tangible representation of God's presence among his people.
And there's another fascinating footnote about the atonement lid. Okay. Which is described as being more than just a lid.
Right.
It's symbolic of the place of atonement, where the blood was applied to cleanse the people of their sins.
Exactly. It highlights the crucial role of sacrifice and atonement in their faith.
Right.
A concept that runs throughout the entire Bible.
I'm realizing how every detail from the layout to the materials carries this symbolic weight.
It does.
And there's this unusual phrase, like the opening of a coat of mail regarding the priest's robe. The footnote offers several different interpretations.
Right.
Which is always fun to consider.
It's a reminder that translating ancient texts isn't always straightforward.
For sure.
We have to carefully consider the context, the culture, and those nuances of language to really get to the intended meaning.
It's like we're detectives piecing together clues to uncover the truth.
We are.
But let's not forget about the Israelites themselves.
Yeah.
They generously brought offerings for the tabernacle's construction. It paints such a beautiful picture of communal participation and a shared desire to create this sacred space for God.
It reflects a deep sense of devotion
Yes.
and a willingness to sacrifice for a greater purpose.
And then we have those skilled craftsmen, Bezalel and Oholiab,
Bezalel and Oholiab.
who were chosen to lead the construction.
Right.
Oh, yes. The footnote about their wise hearts suggests that their skill went beyond mere craftsmanship.
Yeah.
They were able to interpret the divine design with wisdom and make these insightful decisions during the construction process.
It's a great example of how God works through human talent and creativity.
Right.
He doesn't just hand us a set of instructions and leave us to figure it out. He equips us with the gifts and inspiration we need to fulfill his purposes.
And the Israelites, in turn, respond with incredible generosity and enthusiasm.
Oh, they do.
It's inspiring to see how everyone came together to make this vision a reality. Speaking of making it a reality, we finally arrive at the completion of the tabernacle and its furnishings.
Yeah.
That detail about the cherubim woven into the curtain just blows me away.
It creates this stunning visual tapestry of divine presence and protection.
And the instructions for setting up the tabernacle are just as specific as the building instructions.
Every item has to be placed in a particular spot.
Wow.
And in particular order.
It underscores how sacred this space is.
Wow.
And the importance of ritual purity in maintaining that sacredness.
Right. They weren't just putting things together. They were creating a dwelling place for God, and that was a serious undertaking.
Then we get to the climax.
Okay.
The cloud filling the tabernacle and the glory of the Lord descending upon it.
What an incredible moment.
Seriously, it's like all their hard work, all the sacrifices and careful preparation culminate
It does.
in this awe-inspiring display of God's presence.
It signifies God's acceptance and blessing, his affirmation of their efforts.
And that footnote about the shimmer of God's glory foreshadowing a future tabernacle is just beautiful. It suggests that this earthly tabernacle was this temporary dwelling place.
Right.
A symbol pointing to something even greater to come.
That's a great point. The story of Exodus doesn't end with the construction of the tabernacle.
Right.
It points toward a future hope, a time when God's presence will be fully realized among his people.
I think that's a conversation for our next part.
It is.
We've covered a lot of ground already.
It is.
Let's take a break and come back to delve a little deeper into the implications of all this and what it means for us today.
Sounds good.
All right. See you in a bit. Welcome back to our deep dive into Exodus. We left off with that incredible image of God's glory filling the tabernacle.
It's a truly awe-inspiring moment, all the meticulous work, the sacrifices, the challenges they faced. It all leads to this tangible manifestation of God's presence among them.
And as we move forward in Exodus, I'm noticing this shift from those grand miraculous events to something more grounded, more practical. The focus turns toward establishing a structured society with laws and guidelines to govern their everyday lives.
It is a fascinating transition, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, we go from the parting of the Red Sea to detailed instructions about how to build an altar, what to do about damaged property, even how to treat your enemy's lost ox.
Speaking of treating your enemy's ox, there's this law in Exodus 20:23 that says you have to help your enemy get their animal back if it wanders off.
Oh, wow.
It's not exactly what you'd expect to find in a legal code, is it?
It might seem strange at first, but the footnote explains that it reflects this broader cultural emphasis on compassion and neighborly love, even towards those you might consider your adversaries.
It's a powerful concept, extending kindness even to those who might not deserve it.
It is.
And those laws about not oppressing foreigners are especially poignant, given that the Israelites were just freed from slavery themselves.
Absolutely. It seems they were keenly aware of what it felt like to be the outsider, the vulnerable one. It's like this call to empathy, a reminder that we should treat others with the same kindness and compassion that we would hope to receive.
It makes you wonder if we've really learned that lesson as a society even today.
I think that's a question worth pondering.
It is. There are also those laws about ensuring justice for the poor and avoiding false accusations. These principles of fairness and integrity feel so foundational to creating a just and equitable society.
They are, and they challenge us to look at our own systems and structures. They set up in a way that truly promotes justice and protects the vulnerable.
It's a question worth considering even today.
It is.
It's incredible how these ancient texts can spark such relevant and challenging conversations.
I know.
But before we get too deep into those societal structures, I have to ask you about that golden calf incident.
The golden calf.
It's one of those stories that always makes me cringe a little. Moses is up on the mountain receiving the 10 Commandments, and the people down below are building an idol. Seriously.
It's a pretty shocking turn of events, isn't it? And it's a stark reminder of how quickly people can turn away from the true God, even after experiencing these incredible miracles.
The golden calf seems to represent this desire for something tangible,
Yeah.
something visible to worship, even when God had just shown them his power in these undeniable ways.
And I find that ambiguity of that phrase, the sound of the answering, so fascinating. It leaves us wondering, is it the sound of victory of celebration?
Right.
Or is it the sound of revelry gone wrong, of disobedience and chaos?
That ambiguity definitely adds a layer of tension to the scene.
Oh, yeah.
You're right on the edge of your seat, waiting to see what happens next, and then, bam, Moses comes down the mountain and smashes those tablets.
Talk about a dramatic reaction.
Talk about a dramatic reaction. It's this moment of righteous anger, of deep disappointment. The covenant has been broken, their relationship with God fractured by their disobedience.
It's a powerful image
Yes.
of, a shattered covenant.
But even in that moment of brokenness, God doesn't abandon them. He forgives them, renews the covenant, reaffirms his commitment to his people.
It's a beautiful testament to God's unwavering love and mercy, even when we mess up in epic proportions.
It's reassuring to know that there's always a way back.
Always a way back.
But now we're back to the tabernacle.
Okay, back to the tabernacle.
And I have to admit, I'm a little overwhelmed by the sheer volume of detailed instructions.
I know, me too. It feels a little bit like reading an ancient IKEA manual.
It does.
But with much higher stakes.
But as we dig into those details with the help of the footnotes, we start to see the deeper symbolism and meaning behind them.
Absolutely. It's not just about building a tent. It's about creating this microcosm of the universe, a tangible representation of God's presence among his people.
For example, the atonement lid on the Ark of the Covenant is described as the place where God's presence would dwell. But the footnote explains that it's not just a lid. It's symbolic of the place of atonement, where the blood was sprinkled to cleanse the people of their sins.
Well, exactly. It highlights the crucial role of sacrifice and atonement in their faith, a concept that, as you said, runs throughout the entire Bible.
And the craftsmanship involved, those intricate designs woven into the curtains, cherubim pomegranates, all sorts of symbolic imagery. It's like a visual tapestry of divine presence and protection.
It is. It must have been an awe-inspiring sight.
It must have. And the instructions for setting up the tabernacle are just as detailed as the building instructions.
Every item has to be placed in a specific spot, in a specific order.
It's about more than just assembling furniture.
It is.
It's about creating this sacred order, a reflection of the divine order.
And what strikes me is the communal aspect of it all.
Oh, yeah.
The Israelites coming together, pooling their resources and skills to create this dwelling place for God.
It speaks volumes about their devotion.
It does.
Their desire to honor God and make him welcome among them.
They weren't just following orders. They were pouring their hearts and souls into this project.
And that shared sense of purpose, that communal dedication must have been incredibly powerful.
It must have been.
Now, as we near the end of Exodus,
the
tabernacle is complete. And we get that incredible scene where the glory of the Lord descends upon it.
It's a moment of breathtaking beauty and profound significance.
It is.
It's the culmination of all their efforts, a visible manifestation of God's presence among his people.
And that footnote about the cloud and fire representing this shimmer of God's glory, a foreshadowing of a future even greater tabernacle, is just beautiful.
It reminds us that this earthly tabernacle, impressive as it was only a temporary dwelling place. It pointed toward a future hope, a time when God's presence would be fully realized among his people in a way that transcended these physical structures.
What an incredible thought. We've journeyed from slavery to freedom from chaos, to order from fear, to these awe-inspiring encounters with the divine.
We have.
We've seen the Israelites struggle, disobey, and be redeemed time and time again.
It's a story that feels both ancient and incredibly relevant to our own lives.
Absolutely. But before we wrap up our deep dive into Exodus, we need to unpack what all this means for us thousands of years later. What are the enduring lessons we can glean from this powerful and often challenging story?
That's a great question, and I think there's a lot to unpack. But before we do, why don't we take a short break and come back to explore those final reflections together?
All right, we are back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into Exodus. It's amazing how this book, written so long ago, still feels so relevant to our lives today.
It really does. We've seen the Israelites go through so much slavery, miraculous deliverance, wandering in the wilderness, receiving the law, building a sacred space. It's a story about the highs and lows of faith. The struggles and triumphs of a people just trying to figure out their relationship with God.
And it's not always a pretty picture, is it?
It's not.
I mean, they complain about manna, for goodness sake. They build a golden calf while Moses is up on the mountain getting the Ten Commandments.
Right.
Sometimes I wonder what they were thinking.
But isn't that the point, though? It highlights our own human tendency to forget to doubt, to take things for granted. I mean, even when we've experienced God's blessings firsthand, it's so easy to slip back into those old patterns, to focus on what we lack instead of what we've been given.
I think that's something we can all relate to even thousands of years later. It's that constant tension between faith and doubt, between gratitude and a desire for more.
Exactly. And Exodus doesn't shy away from that tension. It shows us that faith isn't about being perfect or having all the answers.
Right.
It's about trusting God even when things are hard, even when we mess up.
And speaking of messing up, the golden calf incident is such a powerful reminder of how far we can stray when we lose sight of what's truly important. It's like they needed something tangible, something they could see and touch
Right.
to represent God,
Yep.
even though he had just shown them his power and presence in these incredible ways.
It speaks to our human need for something concrete, something we can grasp, But true faith often requires us to step beyond what we can see and touch and trust in something bigger than ourselves, something we can't fully comprehend.
And in the end, even after that huge misstep, God doesn't give up on them.
No, he doesn't.
He renews the covenant, demonstrating his incredible patience and faithfulness.
It's a message that resonates throughout the entire Bible. God's love and mercy are always available to us no matter how far we stray. He's always ready to welcome us back, to offer forgiveness and a fresh start.
That's so encouraging, especially when we think about our own struggles and failures.
Yeah.
But let's get back to that final scene in Exodus where the glory of the Lord fills the tabernacle.
Okay.
It's like the culmination of their entire journey,
Right.
a tangible manifestation of God's acceptance and blessing.
It's a powerful image of God dwelling among his people, and that footnote explaining this as a shimmer of his glory, a foreshadowing of a future tabernacle, really stuck with me. It suggests that this earthly tabernacle was just a glimpse, a temporary representation of something much greater to come.
It points to that ultimate hope of a day when God will dwell with us fully and completely, a hope that would later be fulfilled in the coming of Jesus.
Exactly. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Exodus, I think the question we're left with is this: how do we apply these ancient lessons to our modern lives?
Right. We've seen the Israelites grapple with faith, experience miraculous deliverance, and learn to live in covenant with God. What does that look like for us today?
Well, for me, Exodus is a reminder that the journey of faith is rarely easy or straightforward. There will be moments of doubt, times when we stray, maybe even times when we build our own golden calves.
Right.
But it's also a story of hope, of God's unwavering faithfulness and love no matter what we face. We can trust that he is with us, guiding us and calling us back to himself.
And maybe that's the most important takeaway from Exodus. Even in the midst of our imperfections and struggles, we can experience the presence of God in our lives. We can find glimpses of his glory in the everyday, in the ordinary moments, just as the Israelites did in that shimmering cloud above the tabernacle.
Absolutely.
So as you go about your day, keep your eyes open for those glimpses of the divine. And remember, no matter what challenges you face, you are not alone. The God who delivered the Israelites from slavery is still in the business of setting people free.
And who knows, maybe he'll even use you to build a tabernacle or two along the way.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Exodus. We hope you've discovered some new insights, been challenged by some tough questions, and maybe even felt a renewed sense of wonder at the power and relevance of this ancient text. Until next time, keep seeking those hidden treasures of knowledge.